Hi, I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. One of the most pressing concerns when we talk about technology is, of course, its impact on privacy. And the only way to move in device policies and advocate for rules which protect an individual and their data is to evaluate where we stand today. On today's show, we take a look at how 2019 was for privacy in the world of tech. Joining us for this is Mr. Asad Baig, who's a digital rights activist and the CEO at the Media Lab. He joins us from Islamabad. Also joining us is Mr. Einar, Tangen, an analyst, joining us from Beijing. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Einar Tangen, let me begin with you. Now, there have been a number of scandals ranging from apps like FaceApp, a scare that really shook the world, to WhatsApp suing NSO. Do you feel like in 2019, the biggest concern for tech was privacy?
Well, I think it is from the consumer point of view, but the fact is that privacy is something that has kind of flown by. The digital revolution has, in essence, rendered us completely exposed to the entire world. And we see this on a continuous basis, more hacks, more leaks, and this type of thing. And it's going to continue. The fact is the technology exists so that anybody can see practically everything you're doing. And through your social media, they can pretty much gauge everything from your sexuality to your political preferences.
Right. Mr. Asad Baig, as Mr. Einar Tangen stated, from the consumer point of view, of course, privacy is a grave concern. But I want to read out a quote, and this is by Albert Jadari, who is the consulting director of privacy at the Stanford Center for Internet and Society. He was quoted saying, "The fundamental model sustaining the internet is based upon the exchange of user data for free service. As long as advertising dollars drive the growth of the internet, regulations simply will tinker around the edges, setting sideboards to dictate the terms of the exchange." Do you agree with this?
Somewhat. And, just to sort of describe that in simpler terms, we used to say that, and this is kind of an inside joke, that when you're not paying for a service online, then you are the commodity. And this is pretty much true for any online service that we consume, starting from Facebook all the way to Instagram and Twitter and various others that we consume on a daily basis. Now, that's also true, unfortunately, now for the services that we are paying for, such as Uber, Careem, and various other kind of digital companies that we've seen popping up everywhere in the world. And then we've also seen that some of these companies are extremely vulnerable to hacker attacks, and they've in the past have lost their data with close to no legal repercussions whatsoever. Now, I think what Mr. Tangen has said is quite enough for a general overview. But specifically speaking for this region, the South Asian region, I think one of the biggest problems lies in the fact that we are unable to control some of these international platforms, such as Facebook and so on. So we see the European states have enacted something called GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation. But in Pakistan and India, just these two countries, we have a huge population of, huge segment of people who are using internet on a daily basis. In Pakistan alone, we have 68 million users. But both of these countries at this point in time have been completely unable to bring in something of the similar sort through which we can make some of these digital companies accountable in terms of their data usage and data retention, specifically with regards to consumer data. Now, this to me is a big question mark. To be honest.
Mr. Baig, sorry to interrupt, but I want to ask you there, what do you think is hindering these countries, as you mentioned, from being able to implement or even create policies which actually protect consumers more?
You see, there are layers upon layers of factor contributing to it, but I think the biggest factor is the general delay in legislation and so on. So specifically speaking about Pakistan, we saw that the first draft of Data Protection Act was introduced in the previous government's era some 2 years ago, and still in those 2 years period, we see that the priority of that law, the priority of that legislation has been really low in the general legislative circles. So I think it's one about the priority, two about, let's say, if we have a very strong data protection law in Pakistan, right, do we have enough influence on companies over Facebook and companies like Twitter to actually regulate them? Now, this is some other sort of an angle of discussion that we need to also think.
Mr. Asad takes me on that point. That's an important point, and I do want to come back to it. How much influence do individual countries have on these large tech firms and able to influence them? But before that, I want to jump to Mr. Tangen. Mr. Tangen, we're talking about these tech companies, but is the biggest threat only from these tech companies. I mean, we're hearing a lot about the Internet of Things. We're hearing about smart cities, another form of collecting data. Are governments also more responsible for exposing an individual's privacy?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact is that between governments and the private sector, there's really nothing left that anybody can really hide. And I don't say that lightly. 30 years ago, I was on the American Civil Liberties Board for my state and city. And I told them then that the advent of this was going to cause a titanic shift in the expectations and realities of privacy. People were very worried when they heard about the idea of a sovereign internet that was being pushed by Xi Jinping back in 2013. Now, all of a sudden, you see that that is increasingly the case. Countries are taking it into their own hands to regulate what comes in and goes out of their country. In some respects, this is good. In other respects, it could be very bad. So it will depend on the government itself. But this is not the free super highway of information that we all wanted or expected. It really has become something where it's a territorial dispute in addition to an economic one. And I do, for the record, agree with the quote that you have. As long as the income comes from the free side, there is really nothing you could do. It's a cat and mouse game, which the cat will lose.
Right. And Mr. Tangen, just for our audience here, can you elaborate on the economic link to all this data that we're talking about, the collection of this data, and how we're going to see it, the increase of retaining it, increase in the recent coming years?
Well, in essence, you will now have no privacy in terms of where you are, where you have been. China is putting together an e-currency, which is trackable. This has wonderful benefits for society, taxation, fairness, etc. But it also comes at a cost where everything you literally pay for, they will know about. And you're going to continue to see this. The Internet of Things is going to be much more about commercial side, things that you can do with agriculture, making sure they remind a right amount of water and pesticides get to where they need to go. And you know how much you can have an expectation of what crop sizes are going to be. And there are benefits to that. But on the personal side, individuals will, in essence, be subject to this kind of what China is doing, this social credit system, where everything you do will be counted plus and minus against you. This could be very beneficial. It could keep people who are basically con men, I won't say who, but out of positions of high public power. And this could be very important to the world going forward. But it's going to be a different world. The genie is out of the bottle, and you should not have this expectation that what you say and do on the internet will, in fact, stay with you.
Right. Mr. Asad, jumping back to you, before we go and talk about laws in greater depth, now, when we talk about technology, it seems like we're living in a dystopian novel. The surveillance, the way it has increased the number of CCTV cameras all over the cities. Is there a disconnect between consumer awareness and what's actually going on? I mean, we're in 2019, we're going to move to 2020, but do consumers actually have an idea of how much surveillance there is?
No, to answer your question very simply, no, people don't have an idea. And again, to start my note with a quip, 20 years ago, we used to have this notion of the Big Brother, which was, a state ideally from 1984 or something like that. But now the state and the traditional Big Brother has a very evil twin, and that is the corporate sector. And unfortunately, people don't understand the concerns that goes with data retention and so on. And saying, obviously, they far outweigh the benefits that they get from such services, mostly free services, but they have close to no idea of what goes behind the scenes. Some of these cases we've seen that they've come out and people have started to sort of thinking on those lines, such as Cambridge Analytica, for instance, and various other data scans. We've seen that, but still in Pakistan, I would say a vast majority of people who are using online services and digital services are completely oblivious of the fact that they're actually, in some kind of a dangerous situation with this.
Right. And just to borrow words there, because I do think they're quite interesting, a corporate evil twin. How does this evil twin manipulate with its sophisticated mechanisms, manipulate and trick consumers? How are they still out of the loop?
This is a very interesting question. And I think the answer lies in the fact that people still don't understand the way corporates are trying to control the world, literally the political narrative across the world and so on. See Facebook for that matter, and the recent discussion about Twitter and Facebook allowing political ads. And I think it was very interesting to see Mark Zuckerberg go on about free expression and connecting free political ads to free expression. And all of these narratives kind of feeding into one large concern that the corporates are basically now trying to take over the world. And they don't have those those ideologies that a traditional Big Brother would have in many ways, right? So these corporates mostly are not bound by any laws. They're not per se very big on transparency and so on, and there's simply no way to control them. So in many ways, they're much more, this evil twin, so to speak, is much more dangerous than its predecessor.
Right. Mr. Tangen, we're having a really interesting conversation here, and the matter about political ads, Twitter banning them, Facebook choosing not to follow suit was one of the highlights of 2019 in media and tech news. What's your take on that?
Well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, people tend to switch over to other social media sites, whether it's TikTok or even I'm a member of LinkedIn. I know that the information there is being used by others. There's a privacy policy, but it's there. And the issue here is I don't know that it's right to say evil twin brother. What it is these people are solely concerned with return on investment, and they'll do anything they can to monetize what they have. I mean, look at these companies that have been burning tens of billions of dollars as they build markets. They intend to get that back. Don't kid yourself. They're trying to get into a monopoly situation so they can dominate it. And I would agree with my colleague that the real issue here is allowing a few big players to dominate markets, because it either becomes a monopoly or an oligarchy, an economic oligarchy, where they, in essence, wink at each other and try to figure out how they're each going to make money. So, at the end, with capitalism, the irony is that you need a strong government to make sure that capitalism is in fact working. But, going back to this idea that somehow people are being duped, no, they're not being duped. They're the ones who are inviting the camera and giving the information. They invite these cameras, Alexis, all of these things. They're recording. There's now a case in which somebody was recorded, conspiring to commit a crime on their Alexis. So that's going to be used against them. That's an indication. Now,
that point there, sorry to interrupt, that point there is something that I do want to pick apart. You're talking about people inviting these technologies into their homes, inviting smart speakers, inviting several other things that allows their privacy to be invaded. It does go to the central question. Has the concept of privacy changed? Do we not take it as it was, for example, 10 years ago?
Well, there is no sense of privacy anymore. I mean, the truth is that, as my colleague said, people don't realize it. They're only slowly waking up to the fact that they, in essence, traded their privacy in for, a social Twitter network or something like that, or social media network. So this is the reality. People have to either change it or accept it. But in the truth, the only people who can do this are the governments, but the governments have their own agenda. So from this perspective, even if the corporates were out of the picture, I don't think that governments would give up the kind of tools that they say they need to fight terrorism and crime and all of this type of thing. So, and I'm not saying that lightly. I'm just saying that they're not going to give it up. The genie is out of the bottle, and you're not going to put it back in.
And just besides fighting terrorism, there's, of course, an economic underpinning to all of this. How does this collection of data work in the global trade system?
Well, in trade disputes, I mean, there will be more actual data that can be given. Right now, you have old data which is used in new cases. From now on, you'll be able to trace the trade flows. Quite frankly, a lot of the metrics that we have currently are out of date. GDP doesn't make any sense when you have a global supply chain where, China adds $54, but then is charged for a $1,000 iPhone. There has to be a better way. 5G, artificial intelligence, and all of these sensors that we're talking about, this system will give a better sense of metrics. But the question is, how do we use that? How do we characterize it?
Right. Mr. Einar, I just want to go back to a point you made about how this monopoly power needs to be controlled. And of course, the governments need to step in. And that's, of course, something to discuss later, whether governments want to give up on that control or not. But is it possible to actually turn back from this monopoly situation now in the world we're living in for governments to actually control these big tech giants?
Well, yes, actually you can. You see this happening in Europe. There's a lot of pushback against the social media side. During the Great Depression, they passed something called the Glass-Steagall Act in the United States, which separated insurance companies from brokerages from banks. So it is always possible for government to do it, but it takes a major crisis in order to kind of garner the political capital necessary to go against these huge behemoths. They're not going to go quietly into the night. They have big dollars riding on this, and that's the reality of it.
Right, and that's unfortunate that it would take a crisis for governments to actually take a critical look at what's happening on that point. Thank you so much, Mr. Einar Tangen, for joining us from Beijing. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show while we talk about how tech and privacy have been in 2019. We are joined by Mr. Asad Baig, who's a digital rights activist and CEO at the Media Lab, joining us from Islamabad, Meheen Ahmed, digital marketing expert from Lahore, and Ieva Miluna, international law expert, joining us from Latvia. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Baig, as we were discussing before, we talked about localizing certain laws that would allow countries to have greater control over the social media tech firms. How difficult is that?
It's very difficult. I think one of the biggest challenges is maintaining that influence over these companies to ensure progressive regulation. For instance, in the case of GDPR, we see that all of the European states have combined to form that influence. If, for instance, if Pakistan comes up with a law and tries to regulate Facebook and any other digital companies, obviously it's possible, but we surely don't have that kind of influence in terms of economic power and so on. The market in Pakistan as compared to, for instance, the European states is very small. But more importantly, I think, Meshal, one important point that we're missing here is that over the past few years, I've learned that when we talk about privacy, we need to talk about really hyper-local issues. We often tend to talk about big corporates and companies like Facebook and YouTube and so on. But then in the process, I think we somewhere forget to mention the local companies, the local digital sort of bodies who are retaining data and so on. And mind you, these are one of the most vulnerable bodies. And I'll also later in the show talk about some of the very problematic concerns that we've seen in 2019 in Pakistan with regards to data stealing and privacy of the citizens. And so on. But so this hyper-local approach to privacy is also perhaps one of the things we are missing in the larger sort of discussion.
Ms. Miluna, now we talked about the concept of how it seems like privacy doesn't exist in this age. But when we go back and talk about the fundamental human rights and liberties that we all should enjoy, what role does privacy play in that?
Well, privacy plays a big role in human rights, and main human rights instruments are basically protecting the right to private life and privacy. And with the development of social media and artificial intelligence, of course, there are big concerns about privacy, about how these algorithms will observe the right to privacy and observe the basic value judgments that, for example, the machine needs to take.
Right. And let's talk about these algorithms in greater depth. How can they potentially be a threat to human rights?
Well, in principle, in artificial intelligence, there are algorithms that make certain judgments, taking into account certain conditions. And if the master of these algorithms has not taken into account, for example, moral, philosophical aspects of each decision that needs to be taken, then, for example, then the outcome may be contrary to human rights. And here comes in, of course, private to private individual relationship, but also private to state relationship, because if, for example, certain services are provided by a state and an algorithm takes the wrong decision, then we need also a state to intervene to protect those individuals from certain human rights violations. In horizontal relationship, when there are individual to individual, this is much more harder because human rights protection do not apply into the horizontal relationship, individual to individual. But also, of course, with private firms and private companies using artificial intelligence, may come close to the infringement of human rights that states need to protect.
Right. Ms. Meheen, let me jump to you. We've been talking a lot about how this year has been for privacy and how technology has changed the concept of privacy. But just moving back a little and trying to understand how important ad revenue is for these tech firms and how they use our data to actually sell certain products or market certain products to us. Take us through that process.
Yeah, sure. So I believe that privacy is no longer a personal choice. I mean, people have access to your private information. If you have a Facebook account, identity thieves can take your birthday, they can take your pictures, they can take your personal information from your Facebook profile and use that to create products that you, for example, I was talking to a friend that I'm looking for long boots because it's winter and I need to buy them. And I was talking to her, and a few minutes later, I was scrolling through my Facebook and I started seeing ads from different shoe brands. So it was pretty, at first when this started happening, it was kind of scary, you know, how do they know that I need to buy this? And then later on, I realized that, for example, our mic is on when we are scrolling through Facebook. Our locations are on our smartphones. And when we talk about certain stuff with our friends in a physical gathering, our phones tend to pick up on that, and then they provide us with advertisements that we might be looking for or that will help us make a purchase. And also through our caches in our browsers. For example, if you're searching for a certain type of product and you use your search engine to look for it, after a while you start seeing those ads on your Facebook. And similarly, it's also the same when you meet new people and their location services are on their smartphones and your location services are on your smartphone. A few minutes later, you start seeing their suggestions on people you may know. Like at first,
Meheen, stay with me on that point. I want Asad on this as well. Asad, I have my smartphone here. If it's sitting here idle and I'm talk about something, is this just plain paranoia that it could actually relate to something I'm talking about and advertise it to me? Or is there some science behind this?
Look, there in some cases we've seen that there have been information coming out. For instance, I think it was Google's Alexa. Google's device, I'm forgetting the name of that, but in many cases we've seen that people have come out and said that the conversation that you have, or at least that sort of voice note that you have to activate that AI, for instance, OK Google and so on, after that the conversation is being recorded, and that is so to kind of improve the experience and the user experience and so on. And in many cases we've seen that that has already been the case, but passive recording is something that it's mostly paranoia, but it's not just paranoia. So when we meet new people, for instance, one of those, let's say, look us up on Facebook, and they suddenly start showing us on my suggested friends feed. So that's like strange for me. But the point is that they might be looking me up and showing up and so on. Then also there are other kind of these metrics happening in various algorithms. But this is the point, right? The main concern is that most of these algorithmic decision making is transparent. It's not transparent at all. It's what we call a black box. So what goes inside it, we have zero idea. We are only kind of informed by the people who are using it, but we have absolutely zero clue of what actually goes inside it. I think this is one of the biggest concerns in what we are talking about today, the black boxes, the algorithmic decisions that we don't know about. And they're extremely, extremely common online in every digital service that we use. My colleague was talking about ethical and kind of moral and philosophical programming into codes. And that's an extremely good point. So here's the case. All of us, for instance, we are kind of moving into a realm where machine will be actually making decisions. Let's say machines are to make a decision of incriminating someone or prosecuting someone or putting someone in jail.
Right.
Then will they keep in mind or will they take in account their history? And will that problematic history, for instance, we've seen that a lot of people are actually young, black, African-American people, right? So is that history going to kind of also transfer and kind of come into the algorithmic decision-making without that human compassion? Now, that's the biggest question. And unfortunately, that really is the case, because it's like a black box situation that we see happening all around the world.
Right. Ms. Miluna, on that very interesting point that Mr. Baig just pointed out here, whether algorithms can actually have those human elements that we have always prided ourselves on, whether it's empathy or better judgment or contextualizing things, is that even possible with it? Now, we're talking about this, but experts who are responsible for making laws, do you feel like they have gotten to that point in creating an international legal architecture which can deal with all these complex issues that technology brings with it?
Yes, I can sense that they have taken into account the lawyer's perspective and also the philosophical and moral values that need to be taken into account in algorithmic ratios and things. But of course, in instances where there needs to be, and for example, instant decisions need to be taken, then it is highly doubtful that an algorithm can take into account, for example, value judgments, or take an example, for example, particular circumstances of the case that may impact the particular decision, for example, from human rights perspective, especially when there is interventions in human rights.
Right. Mr. Asad, now my favorite examples to give is Mark Zuckerberg's testimony in the Congress and how confusing and embarrassing it was, where all these congressmen really had no idea about how technology works. Now, are our lawmakers who are in place disconnected with how technology works? I mean, if they are, is it even possible for them to devise laws?
I think you must have also seen the video where Alexandria, the U.S. lawmaker, the young U.S. lawmaker from, I think, Latin America.
Right.
And when she's questioning Zuckerberg is completely clueless. So it's not always the case, fortunately, that policymakers are clueless. But the point here is that it's basically like a power game. It's basically like there are two entities and they want the most amount of power, and they kind of engage in a tug-of-war match between each other. And that really is the case. But in all of this process, the biggest I sort of think is the most important point here is the civilian oversight. And the people like us, for instance, who are talking about privacy and kind of watchdogging both the government who are making laws and the private companies who are kind of making sure that they have more space online and so on. And that kind of brings me to the other point which I was talking about earlier, that most of this privacy debate, unfortunately, is coming from global north. And hence, as a result of that, we are almost always focusing on big companies, big tech companies like Facebook and so on. Let me give you an example of what we have seen in Pakistan, for instance, 2019. There is one website, I'm not going to name it, obviously, but that website contains all of NADRA's database, all of the 200 million records that we have in the NADRA on that website. We have on that website all the telephone numbers, most of the telephone companies, all the big digital companies in Pakistan. So all of that data dump is available for free to access on one website. Now, that website has been online for more than 8 months, still is online, by the way. And I see no repercussions of that. I see no initiation of investigation within the parliamentary bodies as to how NADRA leaked all the data, how the private companies leaked all the data. So somewhere something is going wrong, right? And that is right in our backyards. That's not in San Francisco or California or the Silicon Valley for that matter. This is happening right in our backyards.
There's
People
greater ability to take control of the situation here. I take your point there. And Mr. Asad Baig, stay with me on that point. I want to jump to Meheen. Meheen, now we're talking about this disconnect that's very evident. And Mr. Baig clearly mentioned that civilian pressure plays a large role in all of this. How do you feel like consumers at a very basic level could become more educated? Awareness can spread about what their rights are, how they can become vulnerable to these data breaches?
So I would like to mention this very famous case that was going on previously, like last year, on Cambridge Analytica. They are a company that does research for political personalities, but they came under a lot of fire for manipulating the elections in favor of Donald Trump. Now, how did they do that? They basically used personal information from different Facebook profiles and started showing ads that were in favor of Donald Trump or that would help them make their decisions. They only targeted those who had, basically they didn't have any political affiliation or they had no political opinions, so they could be easily manipulated. So
right.
They did that, and then they came under a lot of fire because people eventually realized that, they basically used their private information to change their opinions. So I believe that it's very easy, but it also depends. There are three types of people in the world: people who have opinions, people who are influencers and leaders, and then there are people who are currently building those sort of opinions. So I believe that companies tend to target those who have not formed an opinion yet. And also, as Mr. Baig is talking about algorithms, and machine learning algorithms can actually identify your political affiliation from 9 to 10 tweets. So, I mean, that's so easy because when they did the research, they thought that they would at least need 15 to 20 accounts to actually describe the kind of political affiliation one person would have. But when they did the research, the results were astonishing because they realized only 9 to 10 tweets are needed to know someone's political affiliation.
Right. Meheen, that is one of the cases which has brought international attention to how social media can be insidious, especially in terms of influencing political discourse and in terms of influencing political opinions. And that is something very important. Another thing that I do want to talk about, which has a lot, which is also considered to be very insidious, is facial recognition technology. And this year we heard more and more about it. Ms. Ieva Miluna, now, according to a research report, facial recognition market by component, the facial recognition industry is expected to grow 3.2 billion in 2019. Now, this is a huge growth rate. But what threats does this technology pose to humans?
Well, that imposes a threat to a fake, for example, recognition when an algorithm doesn't recognize the right person. And of course, if the right person is not recognized, then further identity problems and connection problems concerning the identity arise. This is a huge problem because facial recognition may be used in some banking services or some other significant services when people can actually lose some financial means or money. So facial recognition and the threats that may entail is a big problem if it comes to the thing that a fake person may be recognized. And of course, states need to think about it, how they protect the human rights, the human right to private life, to the human right to secure individuals from fake identities,
right.
And so on.
Right. Mr. Asad Baig, on that similar point now, facial recognition, a lot of uneasiness, feelings of uneasiness arise when we talk about it. Is it all bad?
Obviously, nothing is all bad. So there is, the question is how it's being used. Now, that's the biggest point, right? I'm seeing some of the images that you're kind of running between the speakers in this program, and one of them is this algorithm which kind of brings up a picture of kind of like an age difference and makes you look old and so on. And this was something which was going on a lot on Facebook and other platforms. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that there has, for facial recognition to work, there has to be some form of a facial database to recognize that face with, right? And again, point where we are talking about data protection and data storage and data retention and the use of the data. So for instance, if X company has XY million user and facial databases, what are they going to do with it? How are they going to ensure the protection? How are they going to make sure that some of that is being used only for the purposes it's intended for? Now, this is a question that unfortunately we've seen being answered in the worst of ways in the past. For instance, we've seen that the data which was intended for something, in the case of Cambridge Analytica, which keeps coming up in this conversation, was intended for something. It was not used, either not used for that purpose.
Mr. Baig, sorry to interrupt here, but we're running short on time, and I just want to get this last question to you. We've been talking about a number of things, how they have led to privacy breaches, making people more insecure, more vulnerable. Now, in all of this, how much agency does the individual have?
Right now, if you ask me, unfortunately, not much, because most of us cannot opt out from services like Facebook and so on. But I think if there are 2 or 3 things that are very important I would like to mention. One, we need to understand what goes on into some of this, right? Understand the implications, understand the scenarios, and understand the sort of problems and concerns. Then, as citizens, when we are kind of aware of all that, then we kind of put pressure on both the policymaker and the corporates. But before we understand that, unfortunately, nothing really is going to happen.
Right. On that point, thank you much, Mr. Asad Baig, for joining us from Islamabad. Thank you, Meheen Ahmed, for joining us from Lahore, and Ms. Ieva Miluna for joining us from Latvia. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next time with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.